Dear colleagues, comrades, Indigenous sisters and brothers, those who are attending this webinar, participating to this webinar at this moment, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are now. This is the Day 2 discussion of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact series webinars on the Indigenous Peoples Day celebrations on the 9 August. Under the theme of the self-determination and democratization, where are we heading? So this is the third session of the series webinar, and the theme for this session is securing lands, territories, and resources, an instrument in fighting COVID-19 and in achieving Indigenous peoples' self-determination. Welcome to everyone. Let me start by sharing my own views about the land rights of Indigenous peoples before going to the panel, introducing the panel members and other activities. Land rights is central for enjoying Indigenous peoples' human rights, and those human rights provisions are enshrined to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights law and instruments, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Land is the central for the gross human rights violations, severe violations of the civil and political rights. This is because they fight to defend their ancestral land from the new colonial rules, corporate and state agencies' development aggression. Land is the cause of the many violations in our Asia region, political intimidation, the threat to the human rights defenders and women's insecurity. The members of the indigenous political parties and movement organizations of the region who raised voices against land grabbing and often faced extrajudicial killing, arbitrary arrest, detention, and other atrocities. So if we see the land rights of indigenous peoples have different political, economic, and cultural dimension. The political dimension is related to self-determination for the use and control of traditional lands and resources, applying traditions and rules of political and social structure of indigenous peoples. The economic dimension refers to the use of the land and territories of the indigenous peoples for their economic survival through the rule governing soil cultivation, land uses, and harvesting in the traditional territories. The cultural dimension holds land as sacred and something more than economic sustenance, and that the spiritual dimension is connected to indigenous way of life with the nature, traditional land, water, and natural resources. This dimensional approach, the land tenure for indigenous peoples, this dimensional approach connected to the customary rules of governing the land tenure of indigenous peoples. So these three dimensions, what I think, have connected and deeply rooted to the right to self-determination of the indigenous peoples. So if the indigenous people does not hold the right to self-determination and the regulation through the means of the self-governance in regard to enjoying their rights, there is no significant role to play for ensuring human rights and land rights of indigenous peoples. So this session aims to unfold the trends on laying claims on land, territories, and resources across Asia and learn from the experiences on how COVID-19 is impacting the land rights of indigenous peoples. The key questions of this discussion here is that what are the trends and challenges in relation to recognition of land, territories, and resources in the region? What are the impact of COVID-19 on rights to land, territories, and resources? So in this series, 4 panel members are directly joining to us. 2 video messages will be shared, which is coming from the Juan Carling, former Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and also former UN Permanent Forum member, and Mr. Taylor from the International Land Coalition. So welcome to everyone. Now I would like to go to hear the message from the Juan Carling. So let me introduce Juan Carling here. Juan Carling is an indigenous activist from Cordillera region of the Philippines. She has been working on indigenous issues for more than 20 years, from grassroots to international levels. She served as the Secretary General of the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, a regional coalition of 50 indigenous organizations across Asia from 2008 to 2016. She was an indigenous expert from the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2014 to 2016. She is currently the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development Goals. Her fields of expertise include human rights, sustainable development, environment, and climate change, as well as on the principles and application of free, prior, informed consent. So for this webinar series, first message, let's hear from the Juan Carling.
Celebrate the International Day of Indigenous Peoples on August 9. I also want to thank AIPP for putting together these webinars so that we have a platform to present and discuss the burning issues of Indigenous peoples today. I was requested to present on the issue of the SDG. It relates to the right of Indigenous peoples to our lands, territories, and resources. So to begin with, there can be no sustainable development without the security of the lands, territories, and resources of Indigenous peoples, because our lands, territories, and resources are the basis of our distinct identity, of our spirituality, of our identity, of our well-being, of our collective survival and development, as well as the future of the generations to come. Having said that, it's also important for us to recognize that when we talk of the right of Indigenous peoples to our lands, territories, and resources, it also includes the way we manage and govern these resources in meeting our needs and in a relation of reciprocity and interdependence. So when we talk of the management of our resources, we cannot isolate this from our right to self-determination, because as peoples, we have the right to also decide collectively on how we want to use and develop our resources, not only for us, but also for the future generation. And so in that regard, Indigenous peoples are actually practicing sustainable development, because we always regard our resources as something that we need to conserve and protect, and that we only use what we need, and that we need to uphold the common good and not just the individual interest. And if we talk of sustainability, these are the principles that has to guide sustainability. And when we talk of sustainable development, these are the kind of values and practice that should underpin sustainable development. So now, if we look at the SDGs, or the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the goal that refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples is under Goal 2 on ending hunger, and it relates to the need to secure and control lands to end hunger. But as I said earlier, we need to approach the issue of land from a holistic perspective. Now, if we look at how this is being implemented, sadly, we are lagging behind. We are now on the 5th year of the SDG implementation. And the finding is that we are even regressing in a number of goals that are actually very relevant to Indigenous peoples. We are regressing in terms of biodiversity protection, meaning we're losing more than what we are protecting. We are regressing on forest protection. That means deforestation is even getting worse. And we are regressing in terms of reducing inequality. That means there is a huge gap in relation to reaching equality. And that actually also captures what we have been saying, that land grabbing has intensified in the previous years and at present, and the risk that land grabbing will worsen in the coming years is very eminent, because governments are now talking of taking over lands and resources in the name of COVID recovery. Now that we are having a crisis because of the pandemic, it's now being used as an excuse to further grab indigenous peoples' lands and resources for recovery, and also to pursue sustainable development. And this is the risk that we are facing now. So it's as we celebrate the International Day of Indigenous Peoples, we need to step up our efforts and our initiatives and cooperation and solidarity to defend our lands and resources, because this is the if we will let down our guards, then this so-called recovery from COVID will suddenly be imposed upon us. And that is not going to serve humanity better, because we know that these are just an excuse to further economic growth that only benefits the few, and that it will even worsen the inequality that already exists today. So when I say we need to step up our efforts to protect our lands, we need to take action when there are attempts to grab our lands. We need to form and build strongest alliances with other groups, with advocate groups, with other sectors, because it is only in a broad unity that we can demand further accountability of states to respect and recognize and protect our rights to our lands, territories, and resources. And this right is already protected by international human rights instruments. We also need to shout out against business interests that wants to take over our lands and resources, and we need to make it clear that this is that enough is enough in terms of the exploitation in the name of profit. And as we celebrate the International Day of Indigenous Peoples, we should also celebrate our contributions to sustainable development, and we should promote further that we as Indigenous peoples are the ones championing sustainable development, and thereby our rights to our lands, territories, and resources needs to be protected. And that is not just for us, but for the benefit of humanity and the planet. So thank you, and I again wish everybody my warmest, I send again my warmest solidarity as we come together to celebrate the International Day for Indigenous Peoples. So let us affirm our commitment to fight and protect our rights as Indigenous peoples, and we will defend our right to our lands, territories, and resources, and our right to self-determination, because these rights are the ones that will keep our dignity, survival, and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you so much, Juan, for this strong message. And it's as you rightly mentioned about the identity, culture, survival, dignity, how this is connected to our self-determination rights, and also your offer that celebration for the SDGs achievement as indigenous peoples as well, that our contribution we do have. And also thank you so much for addressing this important issue, that management of our resources collectively, and why the self-determination rights is important for us, and why it is very much necessity to us. And now I'd like to move for our panel members. We have 4 panel members. There's Professor. The 4 panel members are Professor Khaka from India. And we have another panel members, Jason Pan from Taiwan, Min from Myanmar, and also Marifel from the Philippines. And I was so excited, I even forgot to introduce myself. So let me introduce now myself, and then I'll give the floor to the panel member. So I'm Binota Moy Thamai. I'm an indigenous Jummo Tripura from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. I have been working with this indigenous issue since my student life, now say more than 20 years practically. And I work for Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Forum, a national forum of indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, and also the Executive Council member of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, the host of this webinar. And apart of that, I am currently serving as an expert member of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also a board member of the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So by saying that, I'd like to invite our next speaker, is the Professor Barjunius Khaka, formerly professor at Delhi School of Economics, Tata Institute of Social Science, and Tezpur University, which is presently a visiting professor at Institute for Human Development, Delhi. His research interests concerned with issues of indigenous peoples, agrarian structure and development, plantation laborers, identity movement and politics, social exclusion and inclusive policies. Professor Khaka had been a member of the National Advisory Council during the UPA government, and also chairman of high-level committee constituted by the Prime Minister of India to study the educational, health, economic status of the tribal communities in India. So welcome, Professor Khaka. So the floor is yours now.
Yeah. So I have 10 minutes. So within 10 minutes, let me point out, put down my ideas. I think indigenous people cannot really be understood without land, forest, territory, and resources. That's very clear. And the best way of securing a land and the resources and the territory is, of course, the self-determinations. And in India, we have layers of self-determinations. It's not possible to have self-determinations in the form of sovereignty. But as it has already been said, that self-determinations in the form of self-rule, of self-government, it always have been possible. And in India, if you really look at most of the linguistic communities, they have the state of their own. And being a state of their own, they have already a privileges over the territory, over the land and the resources. So in a sense, there was already a self-determination within the Union of India for different linguistic communities. But that self-determination was denied to so-called the indigenous people. And it is only through the struggle that they achieved self-determinations, particularly, let's say in the Northeast India. You have Nagaland, you have Mizoram, you have Meghalaya, you have Arunachal, which are predominantly a state which is being run, managed, and administered by the indigenous people themselves. In addition to that, we have, at least in the Northeast, again, a sort of self-government in the form of autonomous district council under the 6th schedule of the Indian constitutions. We have in Tripura, we have in Assam, so that, and of course, even Meghalaya and Mizoram, which have already state, they have also put that. Now, it is through these institutional mechanisms, it is through these forms of self-determination, maybe the form of the state and the autonomous district council, that I think the people from the Northeast have been able to secure the land, the territory, and resources. And unfortunately, this is not the case also with respect to the plain tribals of the Northeast, except for the Bodos who have really managed. Otherwise, if you really look at the plain tribals from the Northeast India, you find that there has been an erosion over the control over the land and the territory and other kinds of resources. Now, I think the latter, namely the erosion over land, control resources, is widespread in so-called mainland India. And this has been largely began, let's say, during colonial rule because of the extension of roads, railways, and other means of communications into these territories, movement of the people from the plains into the tribal areas, and you find that as they moved, they started dispossessing the tribals from the land and resources. Now, this phenomena of dispossessing of the tribals from the land, the territory, is something which got accelerated in the post-independent India because of the role of the state. State immediately after independence was this whole idea of the nation building, and therefore you have to develop infrastructure development, industries, dams, irrigations, and unfortunately you find that most of the resources happen to be in area inhabited by the indigenous people, let's say in mainland India. And therefore, from the very beginning of what's called post-independence India, you find that large number of public sector undertakings really took place, and in the process, it displace or what's called dispossess the tribals from the land and resources. And so you find that even before the 1991, that is a new economic policy and moving into the privatizations, globalizations, etc., we were all in the process of losing our land. Now the post economic reform or post what is called the liberalizations, privatizations, global, things have become worse because now MNCs, the international financial institutions, and the state, all they have really combined together as to how best they can really dispossess the tribals from the land. And if you really look at from 91 to almost 2020, we don't have statistics, but probably you find that large chunk of this dispossession has taken place. And that can be seen in terms of as to how the indigenous people who had always had access to land have become marginalized, and what's called small and marginalized and landlessness. Landlessness increased, and it is this landlessness which is actually pushing them to move out of the territorial area to move into the other villages and the cities to work in the informal sector. So you find that large chunk of the tribals now, either because there's a lack of because of sure lack of employment, you find that they're moving elsewhere, and this is what really happened. So during this COVID fight, you find a large number of them were stranded. They had to walk back to their home, and so many of them may have got infected. Now the problem is that once they go back, and if they're infected into their own areas, particularly in mainland India, probably there will be a very difficult time because the health infrastructure as well as other infrastructure is extremely poor. Over and above, you find that because of the dispossession, the poverty level of poverty or people living below poverty level is very high. So you just to give an example of an Odisha, which is one of the most exploited in terms of resources, you find that ever since the liberalizations, the number of people becoming poor has increased. In 93, it was 71%. In 1999, it became 73%. And in 2004, 2005, it was 75%. So you can see, this. I'm just giving an example of one of the states as to how with that you find that people are extremely becoming poor, and with that it will be extremely difficult to cope up with the COVID. Like now, under the COVID, you find that in India they have taken the Disaster Management Act, and basically is imposing lockdown, and because of the lockdown, it is extremely difficult for people to address, to protest, or to mobilize themselves. But then state is using the COVID as one of the ways in which to raise its growth, and therefore just recently, just 2 weeks back, you find government of India has auctioned 41 coal blocks, and all these coal blocks happen to be in the tribal areas. And in the auctioning, you find it was a virtual meeting, and through virtual meeting, they have completely diluted what is known the environmental impact assessment, and thereby you find there's no participation. So arbitrarily, unilaterally, you find the government of India, in fact, now imposing its own agenda of how to augment the growth because of the COVID. And I think we as indigenous people are going to suffer the most. I think we have to therefore fight, and there are certain kinds of rights which we won through our movement. But unfortunately, after we won the movement, we have not really been trying to address those very provisions which we won, and like the Forest Rights Act, or what is called provisions of Panchayat extensible areas. And this is because the rights have been given, but rights to get implemented has to be fought, has to be mobilized. And that is precisely where we are now today. We have achieved the rights, but we are not really trying to mobilize ourselves in order to see as to how they can be ensured. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Kaka. You have rightly addressed some good example also for the self-determination rights in the Mizoram, Nagaland, and also the self-governance structure in the Northeast India, some states like providing this autonomous district council, which is also to some extent a good example for the good governance structure. And also thank you for sharing the other situation, like for example, the forest indigenous people situation in Odisha, and also other challenges, the health and other infrastructure, so on. So since the time constraint, so let's move to other panel members. I thank you again, Professor Kaka. So our next panel member is the Jason Pan Adawai. He's from the Paje community, one of the lowland Pingpu indigenous groups of Leotan village, Miaoli country of central Taiwan. He is an executive of Tara Pingpu, member organization of AIPP, fighting for official recognition for Pingpu groups and joining the struggle for indigenous people's rights in Taiwan, and have been active in Asia Indigenous Peoples' Rights Movement, participating at the United Nations and other international forums since early 1990s. Jason is a former AIPP Executive Council member and works as an indigenous journalist with job experience and contribution for several media outlets in Taiwan. In assisting AIPP and other national indigenous organizations, Jason has conducted major indigenous people's rights workshop or training program in Taiwan, Nepal, Thailand, India, China, and Japan. So now let's welcome to Jason. So Jason, is your floor.
Thank you, Pinota, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm from Taiwan, and here is for if people can see a little bit my main point. Under COVID-19, Taiwan is a very interesting example. Actually, we're a small island, and so that's relatively easier to manage. And most of Taiwan indigenous people, they are in the main Taiwan island, but there's also an offshore island, the Orchid Island. So that's the Dawu people. So Taiwan has a relatively good management of the COVID-19. So there's been this is also, as I said, because we're islands, so easier to have a barrier exit, entry control of outsider. That also another fact is that there's a fairly good established health system. So Taiwan is not as affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, having said that, there are some situations, in fact, we are up to about 470 people throughout this half year of infection. But fortunately for IP people, most of the infection are in the cities, in the major centers. So the indigenous people, including the Pingpu people, the Plain Aborigine, and also the mountain people, the recognized IPs, they are less affected. In fact, as I said, most of the infection are in the city. So there is no COVID-19 major serious transmission in the IP community. So that means it's relatively easy to management. Having said that, there's a major economic impact though on the IP and the society, because there's a loss of income. The COVID-19 affects all economic sector in Taiwan. I know this is going around the world, so everybody knows the decline in economic activity, people loss of income, and jobs cut. So that also affects many indigenous communities. Some people, they have lost their job or less work or less income in the tourism, restaurant, service sector. So some IP, they go back to their home village or community in the mountains or in a village for farming. I'll come back to that a bit later. So the major disruption in terms of for what Taiwan IP and also for natural resources, land and management is that firstly, there's a this is number the other the people can see. Okay, I'm coming to the next points. So there's a disruption of culture and tradition. Several the cultural events has been postponed because government actually have rules saying no major gathering and social distance, of course, so people knew that. But that means quite a lot of IP, for example, in the East Coast, Hualien and Taitung, the harvest festival in the summer called Idising has been some has been pushed back, but some are being held. But with community, they impose control. For some, they only allow very few outsiders. Others, they have more go back to the original traditional way of say the entertainment and music, but on a reduced scale. So that's also a big impact on the traditional people way of life. But having said that, there's also the revival of rituals. That is there are some ritual to purge purification. That is IP their own way, in which some of these ceremony has not been conducted in since like over 50 years and some over 100 years. It's an indigenous people way of driving the evil spirit, because that's how COVID-19 or major transmission diseases is viewed. So there's a revival of that culture. That means people are coming back. So holding these traditional culture. Now, having said all these, this the COVID-19 is also, as I said, outbreak, but it's a crisis. But also IP is also an opportunity. There's for example, tourism, also service sector is down, but the IP village, several of them in Taitung, Hualien, and in the west, they are able to impose their own self-management. That is, they block the roads and not allow visitors come in. So they manage the health issue themselves. So they're also working with the local government, getting the mask, some health devices, material into the village, but they will not allow outsiders to come in to prevent infection, because people are getting fear of infection. So they are imposing their own control that is going back to the customary law of management by council, and no outsiders are coming in. So that's in a good way in terms of a new opportunity. Now I'm coming back to the other last point. You'll see that number 6 and 7. Okay. Return to land farm resource management. This is a phenomenon maybe in other countries. Many IPs community people lost their job or economic activity in the city, so they return to their home community, and that it's in a way improvement for self-management, the land and farming. For example, the government recognized IP and Pingpu people. Many people go back to their traditional way of farming and natural resource management. The COVID-19 outbreak has meant less people visiting from outside. That means the community can be better managed themselves, and also in a way they could make some of the ancient, the original traditional practices coming back. So that's in a way how people management. For example, in Taidong, the southern mountains, there's the Bunun culture, so Namasha area. They conducted their own ritual like Lusan La Paspas. It's in a reduced scale, so they are not allowed visitors in, but they are doing these traditional festival in their own way. That means people coming back, but also in terms of a little bit more the self-management of their culture. And also another one in the Baiwan people, the village called Tubang. They again they have this Tujula Kon Liu festival, and also in as I said, the Hualien area, some places they go back to the original. They have the Ilixing, the harvest festival in the summer, both in the East Coast and the longitudinal valley. So in a way, there are less people outsider, but COVID-19, but it's also opportunity for IP community to take back control, but also establish their own land and management and natural resource access to natural resources. Because as we know, many countries around the world, they are imposing so-called lockdown. So IP community in some area of Taiwan, they're actually doing their own lockdown. That is, they block the road so outsiders don't come in. As I said, this has the first purpose to prevent outsider bringing the virus or transmission. There is not much of that anyway in Taiwan, but that also means revival or the traditional way of management and customary law, and village council starting asserting control back. And there's another factor for the natural resources that this is the number 7 point here. Is that Taiwan is near, actually across the strait from China. So China has also big affected by the COVID-19 virus. So, but their industrial economic output is down. That means this situation also in India, there's air pollution and CO2 emission has cut down. That means the farming and also the natural ecosystem is revival, getting back to the old ways. And also, so it also is a way for the IPs and also the Pingpu youth, their networking with international groups to more effect in the climate change, asking government using this opportunity to highlight on the air pollution, particular CO2 emission problem. So in some ways, there's the crisis can turn into opportunity, and it's the Taiwan's way. It's a bit more unique situation, I know, because many people say, oh, Taiwan's doing a good job, but it's also because we, a small island, we're imposing better control. But as I said, there's a way of, seems for better own management and IP community. Okay, so that's the Taiwan situation for IPs. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And you have really addressed like how in this COVID-19 time also we can redesign our resource sustainability and how our traditional customary system we can use for the land management and also territorial management and also the resource management. And there's also how it can help to get rid of from the climate disaster in coming days. So I thank you for that. And so, dear audience, now we had a we traveled to India, and from India we traveled to Taiwan. So now let's travel to Italy. So let's hear a message from International Land Coalition representative. His name is, let me introduce first. His name is Mr. Mark Taylor. He is the director of the Global Secretariat of the International Land Coalition, hosted by the International Fund for Agricultural Development in Rome, Italy. He is a citizen of Botswana and have a PhD in social anthropology. He has worked on human rights and environmental issues for the last 30 years across Africa and the rest of the world. The International Land Coalition is a global alliance of over 250 multilateral and civil society organizations based in 78 countries. Their collective goal as a network is to realize land governance for and with people at the country level, responding to the needs and protecting the rights of those who live on and from the land. Their members call this people-centered land governance. ILC works for equitable land distribution and public investments that support smallholders, farmers, indigenous peoples, and women to be at the center of sustainable and resilient food system. So let's hear the message from Mark Taylor, because the time difference, he could not directly join us. So Mark Taylor, message now.
Of the International Land Coalition. We're very proud that the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact is a member of our coalition, because among all peoples facing land grabbing and land loss in the world today, Indigenous peoples probably feel that more than anyone. You may have seen the report from our member Global Witness that came out last week. They said in 2019, of the more than 200 people that lost their lives defending the lands, territories, and natural resources of their communities, 40% were Indigenous peoples. So this has been a struggle for many, many years, but particularly now in this period of COVID-19, we see heightened land grabbing, we see heightened danger to Indigenous peoples losing their lands. Right now, as we speak, I remember AIPP People's Development Program in Kenya are being removed from their ancestral territory in the Mau Forest, and people are losing their lives. And we know similar stories from Nepal and other countries in Asia. And so, firstly, we stand in solidarity with you in this difficult time, and particularly in this very critical time to protect and to ensure that more territory and more land is not lost, and to support as best we can the defense of those territories. But I think the most important message from us is that as we look ahead and we think of building resilience and building strong food systems, building strong social systems, building more inclusive economies, fighting climate change and really changing the way that we live, Indigenous peoples are an inspiration to the world, and there's much that the world can learn from you and from your communities in how we can live more safely, more sustainably, more healthy. So thank you for the example that you give to the rest of the world. We stand here with you, we support you in your efforts to secure lands, territories, and natural resources around the world. And we wish you the best in this webinar and in your efforts, and we stand with you, we work with you, and we support you. Greetings from the International Land Coalition family to all of you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Michael Tyler. Sorry, I'm pronouncing the wrong way. Yes, as you have mentioned, it's actually the very concerning and worrying issue for indigenous people as well. Like you have mentioned, 200 land rights defenders were killed, and mostly are indigenous peoples. It's as you have just mentioned. So as I mentioned in the beginning, that why the land is central for all the gross human rights violations. This is the study is also a pro. So I'd like to also ask before going to other panel member, I'd like to ask the audience if we have any questions, please send us through, and then we can respond after addressing all the panel members. So now let's move from Europe to Asia, Italy to Mekong, to Myanmar. So we have our panel member E. Min. She's the present director of the promotion of indigenous and nature together called POIN, an executive council member of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact in Chiang Mai, Thailand. She has been working for the civil society movement, especially rights-based approach to development in the country since 2007. POIN was founded in response to the lack of organizations led by indigenous peoples working for indigenous peoples issues and advocacy on indigenous peoples' rights in Myanmar. Min's role at POIN facilitates the formation of a common platform for indigenous peoples in Myanmar in terms of environmental programs and natural resource management, and acts as a mediator between government, private sector, and indigenous communities for bringing about constructive engagement on sustainable development of the country. She has been a part of the Spectrum, which is known as a Sustainable Development Knowledge Network. She is also founder and organizer of Lovers of Myanmar Environment. She was also a part of World Concerned Myanmar. So most welcome now, Min. So now the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to highlight that for indigenous people everywhere in the world, all our livelihood, all our survival, all our identity, everything we relying on the land we habitat in. That's why land, territory, and natural resources that we live together with our lifelong is very much important. Without land, we cannot survive as well. That's why land is very much important for our indigenous people. And land grabbing is a major threat for indigenous people nowadays and worldwide, also in Asia, also in my country. The main threat after land loss and because of land grabbing for many reasons, most of the thing is the major impact for indigenous people is like migration, either inside the country or outside the country. And along with migration, the problem is also trafficking. And indigenous women also sometimes facing threat because of migration and trafficking problem as well. And during the COVID-19 period, we heard a case that like Thailand and for our current indigenous community, like between Thailand and Myanmar border, there are elephants who are part of ecotourism in Thailand, but it's very expensive to maintain the elephant during close down. And the elephant need food and they need the forest to survive during close down. So the elephant are released back to the forest and for their survival at those time. We heard like those news. And at that time, I'm also thinking that how about for the indigenous people habitat? They are the one dwelling in the forest and the natural resources they have. Due to many reasons, they migrated different part of the world or different part of places. But now during COVID-19, how about their habitat? For them to be able to respond to this kind of situation, they need a land to settle back in as well. Without land for them to go back, how can they survive? This is the main thing I have a concern during this COVID-19. And traditional way of indigenous people also include lockdown, because we talk to one different community, we are working together and doing advocacy together. How are you and how is the situation with you? Then they mentioned that okay, we lock down our places because of government regulation. At the same time, this kind of lockdown we also have in our traditional way. We use a different whenever there is a kind of a outbreak of certain diseases like the mice certainly have a large population at those time. They also have lockdown. Those is already in the traditional way of living of lockdown as well. Indigenous people, they are okay to live in their habitat with their separate way of living style. And however, for this special International Days of Indigenous People coming August 9, when we discuss with different indigenous community, they are willing to separate this important day for indigenous people, set up this UN mechanism, and these are going to celebrate in their respective community, and also they are going to do tree plantation in their respective community. This shows that in whatever situation, indigenous people are the stewardship of this natural environment we have. For our country in Myanmar, we have a new government and new democratic transition during the past few years, and then we have federal discussion. However, this has been taken a long time, and our next election is coming November, so we don't know what will happen next year. And after coping with this new normal situation of COVID-19 and the federal discussion with the new government, what will happen, we don't know. However, we do hope that they will have certain commitment for the indigenous people customary land tenure in our country, that because this is an ongoing issue for us. And we are in the ongoing development of new land law. And in this new land law, there are discussion of customary land tenure. And there are some rule of customary land tenure issues, problems, issue to be solved is given to Ethnic Affairs Ministry as well. So in the past, we don't have, although we might have a national land use policy, there is no one who is in charge or who is mandated to take care of customary land tenure issue. But now things are moving at a very slow rate, but there are some progress on it. Another thing in our country is related to Convention on Biological Diversity, and there are law and policy changes, and there are inclusion of community protected area recognition. However, we don't know how will this come with the administrative system. These are just changes in the law and policy at the moment. Another one is under the Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing. We need to pay respect to the role of traditional knowledge. This is also important for indigenous people. So for us indigenous people, what we are preparing for ourselves is we trying to document community protocol to protect our rights at the same time to promote diversity protection of our region. These are the things ongoing we are working on so that we can help protect and promote our rights. So now is the time in new normal. So I think it is also the time to give a role and respect the role that indigenous people can contribute to protecting this natural environment. We know every country economy are declining, and every time we think of development project and development to bring for a country is come to the area, the place of the land of indigenous people. So we are also concerned looking at those situations as well. And we also concerned that the excuse that, okay, because of like this situation, we cannot conduct FPIC, maybe we should reduce the participation, no consultation, we need to move for fast, things like those. We don't want to, we have a concern that we don't want those kind of situation happen, because for indigenous people, FPIC is very much fundamental right for us. So we really want to encourage, there is a need to find out new approach and new normal situation in our country as well as in the region for indigenous people rights. So I come up with some recommendation. In my recommendation, I would like to highlight only 2P, protect and promote. These are the things we need for indigenous people, protect and promote. First is because with this, all these problem and pandemic are happening nowadays, and we are facing nowadays just because we don't listen carefully to the cry out of indigenous people and the crying out of environment and natural resource depletion. Now we are facing this problem already. We should take a good lesson learned If we want to protect the environment and natural resources for the well-being, the promotion of well-being of all human beings, then I would like to highlight some recommendation on that. So protect indigenous people so that we can promote indigenous people role and indigenous people participation in decision making. That's very first important things. And protect and promote indigenous people land tenure rights so that we achieve what we want to get in sustainable development. The third one, we need to protect biodiversity and natural resources, which are valuable for human survival. And for that, we need to promote roles of traditional knowledge and giving respect to those traditional knowledge. Number 4 is we need to protect indigenous people from human rights violation. As already some cases highlighted by previous speaker, we need to protect them. They are the one who protect the natural environment. Then we need to protect indigenous people from those violations in order to promote sustainable development goal where the whole world would like to achieve nowadays. This is my main recommendation and just sharing of some situation in my country and in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, I mean, this is very well articulated recommendations that we can surely take up for campaign and advocacy, because land is the central for our territorial governance, self-determination rights, autonomy, self-governance. And now let's move to Philippines. We have Marifel Makalanda. She is from Tuwali Indigenous Community Ifugao, presently working as the regional coordinator Panganay, Cagayan Valley Indigenous Peoples Alliance. She is also the vice president of the board of trustees of the Cordillera Youth Center and advisory council member, and advisory council member at Young Indigenous Peoples Network. She helped build and raise the capacities of the indigenous peoples in Cagayan Valley for them to be able to assert their rights. She also conducts and facilitates trainings, seminars, educational discussions, and workshops to youth, women, indigenous peoples, and farmers, documentations and production of educational campaign materials concerning the indigenous peoples, youth, women, and farmers, writing and production process of situational and education training module for the youth and indigenous peoples and on climate change. She also represents the indigenous peoples at the local, national, and international trainings, conferences, and seminars on indigenous peoples, youth, women, and the environment. So I like to invite Marifel. You have a ground working with the indigenous youth, women, and also farmer. We have a diverse experience, ground experience. So yeah, let's hear from Marifel. Marifel, you are welcome. So the floor is yours.
So thank you for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening to everybody. So I will be presenting the experiences of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines in terms of territories, lands, and resources. I think I have a PowerPoint. May we ask the help? Okay, so there. So this is a collation of stories and reports from the various indigenous peoples organizations and communities in the Philippines. So next, please. Next slide, please. So our ancestral lands and all the biodiversity found here are integral part of the indigenous people's lives and are important part of their right to self-determination. So self-determination in the IP's context is determining our own ways of life, the programs and projects that we need and are appropriate in our community, and development in our own phase, which is more sustainable and not by the government and the corporations. Next, please. There should be a text there. Okay, next slide. Okay, however, these are targeted by the state and corporations in the guise of for the common good, but in fact, it is for the interest of the few. In pursuit of their, next please. Okay. So in pursuit of their neoliberal economic agenda, the Philippine government implements policies, programs, and the so-called development projects that displaces indigenous peoples and violates their rights to self-determination. Okay, so the following are some of the challenges that the IPs in the Philippines are facing even during this COVID-19 pandemic. So here are some of the manifestations. So first is the energy dams and water supply projects, majority of which are under the Build program of President Duterte, and is also part of the Philippines implementation of the SDGs. So we're in more than 100,000 indigenous peoples from at least 106 villages will be displaced. Next. Next is mining. So around 230 of the 447 approved mining applications are in ancestral territories, encroaching in at least 542,245 hectares of ancestral lands, or 72% of the 748,590 hectares covered by all the approved mining applications. Next. And there's also plantations, most of which are part of the Integrated Forest Management Agreement, or IFMA, and the National Greening Program, or NGP, of the Philippine government. At least 130,000 hectares. This does not include the expansion and new applications of ancestral lands are occupied and controlled by giant local and foreign corporations for different kinds of monocrop plantations. Next. And there are also infrastructure and special economic zones still also under the Build program. So those are some of the examples: the building of mega roads, setting up of a new city or techno hubs, military complex for US military exercises, and airports. And all of these are for business purposes and tourism. Next. Okay, so in addition to the programs or projects that was presented earlier, in addition to those is the poor health and economic conditions in the Philippines, especially in the indigenous peoples communities. So it's not actually different from the health and economic situation of IPs all over Asia. So these projects and programs are continuing amidst this pandemic. COVID-19 is used to pursue these projects and programs while repressing the people using the restrictive policies imposed in relation to COVID-19. For example, in the case of the Dipio village, as you go back to the previous slide. Yeah. So as you can see in the photo below, that happened in the village of Didipio in the province of Nueva Vizcaya here in Cagayan Valley, where in the Oceana Gold, it's an Australian-Canadian mining company, continues to operate despite its expired mining permit and during this pandemic. When the People's Barricade tried to stop the mining company's fuel in entering the mining site, the Philippine National Police that assisted the company violently dispersed the barricade and even arrested one of the leaders. And after this incident, and despite the public protests on what happened that day, it happened last April 6. Just recently, the Philippine National Police also charged the other 15 residents of the community who joined the barricade for violating the policies of COVID-19, such as social gathering, social distancing, and assembly. When in fact, they were only there just to protect their lands and territories. The attack against them did not end there because of the strong opposition of the community against the mining in their community. The police and military forces were deployed in the community using this pandemic as a reason, and also their anti-insurgency program. The military forces are claiming that there is a presence of the rebel or the New People's Army in the area. However, according to the community, there are no rebels in the area, but they know that the military forces were deployed in the area so in order to pacify the strong opposition of the community. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, Remedios Nagangi, one of the woman leader of the village, actually said that there's a possibility that we could develop new medicines even for this COVID-19 because we are rich in natural resources. But we need for the government to support our health system. The rights of indigenous peoples are respected and our natural resources should be nurtured. However, our lands and resources have been exploited by other people and big companies and are utilized abroad. So our natural resources are not being used for the community and for the whole nation. Next, please. Yeah. Just click this. Okay. So in addition to this, while the indigenous peoples are struggling to defend their land, territories, and resources and trying to be safe from the coronavirus pandemic, we continuously face state repression through threat, harassment, illegal arrests and detention, and killings. And with the anti-terrorism law in the Philippines, which was signed into law by the president in the midst of this pandemic, we expect human rights violations to rise on top of the cases of violations due to the repressive policies implemented during this pandemic, especially that the leaders and members of indigenous peoples and farmers organizations or those who are only vocally expressing their situations and demands are tagged as terrorists by the state. Sacks, flyers, tarpaulins were scattered in the various communities and town centers, also in the social media, tagging the community leaders and the organizations as terrorists. With this, the democratic space for indigenous peoples and other democratic sectors are now much more limited in the country, especially with the current restrictive policies due to this pandemic, which we feel is being used as additional reason to suppress the voices and the continuing struggles of the people. Next, please. So, however, despite these continuous attacks against us, we continue to speak out and defend our land, territories, and resources, even in these hard times. We look for ways on how to continue educating our fellow IPs on their rights, providing true and timely information, and in strengthening the community organizations and unities. Otherwise, if we don't do this, if we restrict ourselves because of the restrictive policies being imposed because of this pandemic, our land, territories, and resources will be gone, and it will affect not only the lives of the indigenous peoples, but also the whole of society and the next generations. And if a calamity or another pandemic strike us, then it will further endanger our lives. And it's also because of these attacks to our civil and political rights that we continue to resist and further strengthen our unities, not only in our communities and country, but we also need to link these struggles with the wider public from the local to the international level. And we believe that securing and developing our land, territories, and resources using our indigenous knowledge and practices will help in the development of the world's economy and will better help in addressing the calamities or even the pandemics, such as this COVID-19. So that's it, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Marifel, to bringing up this situation. And we all are more or less aware that how the corporate aggression is taking place in indigenous peoples' land, territories, and how the state mechanisms also are using to protect those corporate agencies, corporate sectors like these mining companies, and also the plantation companies and other private sectors. That's how also the cost of militarization, and that causes gross human rights violations every now and then in our indigenous people's land and territories. Thank you for bringing this up and sharing with the audience. Now let's move to the question and answer. We are actually overwhelmed with so many questions here to all the panelists. And because of the time limitation, we don't think we really can cover all these questions at this moment. However, I am addressing a few questions, those who are targeted directly to the panelists. So there is one question for Professor Kaka, come from the audience. How do we make government of India implement the acts and rights of the tribals at the ground level? And this is one. And to Jason also, there's a question: how and what mechanism, procedural process to recognize the indigenous people's own system to contain COVID-19 or manage? So this is a question to Jason. And there is also a question, maybe can also question to Marifel. Case from Philippines is very important. So the similar situation will be happen in Nepal or South Asia. So it is better to tell indigenous peoples and prepare in advance indigenous people's rights of nature and relationship. But how? So this is the question to Marifel. So please take note, the panelists, panel members, and also other questions is can pick up by any one of you, including E-Main. Is that how do you view about community collective land rights or forest ownership? Is that a recommendation for ensuring community territory against outside investors, land grabbing or land transfer from separate individuals? So let's go for this first round response, then we'll move to second round, then we'll see how we can cover. So Professor Kaka.
This is an issue which is extremely problematic because we are, or indigenous people are part of so-called, the larger Indian state. And within the larger Indian state, we have also a provincial state. And most of the indigenous people are actually fragmented or divided along the various provincial states. So what is really happening is that I just see it is basically a kind of a conflict between indigenous people on the one hand and the provincial state on the other and the central union of India on the other. Because I think states, provincial as well as union of India, they need growth. That's their obsession. That they want economic development, rapid what is called exploitation of resources. Because the more you are able to have a growth, the more you are able to distribute. But those growth that is coming, the benefits out of it is not really being pushed to the indigenous people. Actually, it is completely being cornered. So you look at everything in terms of infrastructure, whether you talk of education, whether you talk about the health, you don't find it as much as you find elsewhere. So you find basically India, as far as indigenous people is concerned, is still in the colonial mode. We are still a part of the colonial framework. and therefore the indigenous people have to be constantly appropriated, the resource appropriated for the development of the larger people. So this inequality or unequal development is what it is, and they will continue to perpetuate it because, as I said, the resources inhabited resources where tribal people live is so rich that the resources has become a curse today. If those resources were not there, it would not happen because it become a curse, and you find that extremely aggressive mobilizations or of the, like say, non-indigenous people in terms of promoting what they call the development. And the moment you resist, the moment you try to mobilize yourself, as in case of Philippines, they're called terrorists. We are we are Naxals in the sense that we are trying to overthrow the state government. We're trying to throw the government to the state. So if you just keep quiet, you are okay, you're fine. You are then a barbarian, uncivilized, primitive. You can't do anything about it. But the moment you mobilize, then you become the other extreme, that you are a radical, you are an Naxal, you are a terrorist, and you want to overthrow the state. So this is the problem. And therefore, whatever is that we want to look at legally, yes, there are many legal instruments which we have won out of our own mobilization. As I said, Forest Rights Act is one, and the particular Central India provisions of Panchayat extension, the self-rule at the level of the village is there. But then what you find that as the self-rule moved to the state, they completely diluted the provisions which was actually given in the Central Act. So it doesn't really make sense. So only way in which is for the people to mobilize and to fight. And of course, that we have been fighting for last 200 and 300 years. But the only thing is that the government has always been hostile. It is only of late that at least the Jharkhand government and to some extent Chhattisgarh government has been little pro-tribal. And therefore, these are the two states where there's a possibility of negotiating. But in other states which are so hostile to indigenous people, it is extremely difficult. So, only way left for us is to struggle and to mobilize and to fight, maybe by taking a legal measures or legal instrumental measures rather than the others, because otherwise we'll be completely, what's called destroyed in terms of the state forces.
Jason, please.
Yes, in terms of mechanism at the local level, indigenous community fighting the COVID-19 situation. Actually, Taiwan very early on, they imposed a top-down policy to fight the COVID-19. I think it's starting last December or this year, January. This is similar in many countries, but Taiwan, I think, did it very early. So they have a central control as a command center to fight the COVID-19, headed by the health minister called Chen Shizhong. So all the fighting COVID-19, he imposed on, taking on mask, no mass gathering, and also social distance. So you have to follow that as a government policy. So that in a way, in many countries or in Asia, there is that the central government taking control and they impose such policies, good or bad, we don't know. But Taiwan does have a very good job. It's largely contained. So we're fortunate that the local community IP village do not have a large transmission COVID-19. So what I'm saying at the local level is that there's also central government, but there's also the city, township, the local government. And what I would recommend is what I've been seeing is that the IP community as a village, in terms of their village council, working with the local government level to, number one, get the medical resources needed, get the masks, and getting the kind of, imposition for self-management. For example, they managed to negotiate ways, as I said, some village to block the roads so the outsider don't come in. So you could work within that kind of the local level with the government representative. And of course, it's also fortunate Taiwan has most villages, IP community have a medical station, at least some doctor, nurses, and working with them, they are helping the indigenous people to cope with, a possible transmission or outsider coming in, and we refuse outsider coming, saying there is this COVID-19 pandemic. So in a way, as I said, the self-management, the village council are also using the opportunity to stop outsider and stop tourism development. So in terms of Taiwan, for land territory resources in the indigenous community, the tourism sector, the land grabbing is largely by these developer, real estate development, tourism resource. So with the COVID-19, we're able, in some cases, they've been able to or shut down or delay the project, and even stop, coming completely. So working with the local community and the health authority is one effective way for indigenous people as a mechanism to cope with COVID-19 and all its economic effects derived from it. Thank you.
Yes, so we can move to. Are you ready, Marifel or Emin? Marifel, okay.
Yes, Binata.
Yes, please.
Can you please repeat the question a while ago? Wait, Binata, I can't hear.
The question is, as you have just shared about the Philippine situation, how these private sectors, including the militarizations and also big dam constructions, are causing human rights violations, including affecting displacement to indigenous peoples, their land rights, from their land rights. So the question is coming from here, the similar situation will be happened in Nepal or in the South Asia.
Yeah.
So how we can prepare in advance as indigenous peoples to ensure our rights of nature and maintain the relationship? So there's the question to you.
Okay, yes. Thank you, thank you. Actually, it's really very difficult. No, if you are being tagged as terrorists, and then if there's a heavy militarization in the communities where we are living or where we are working, but we know how persistent and creative the indigenous peoples are, and for example, here in the Philippines, if our civil and political rights are being encroached, then we are more resistant. We resist the violations committed against us by building a stronger unity among the indigenous peoples. Although it's very difficult in this COVID pandemic situation that we are in. But for example, in our case, we try to print out materials so that when we also go to the communities, we have to maximize our time in discussing their rights as indigenous peoples, and also to educate them further on the national situation that is happening in our country, and to provide them resources, knowledge in relation to their rights, so that they may be able to defend their rights. The most important thing here is they should be united, as indigenous peoples, so that they may be able to protect and defend their rights, such as the example, for example, in the Dipyu village. Even there's a presence of the Philippine National Police, and then the military forces, but because they are united, they were able to defend their rights. But of course, it's still an ongoing challenge.
Okay, thank you, Ewan.
Okay. When talking about community collective land right, this is very much important. So if we look at to the human body, we need all parts together. And for indigenous people, land is not only land for settlement, we need land for agriculture, we need land for our traditional medicine, we need land for fellow area, things like that, no? So we, like in the Philippines, we learn about their ancestral domain title process, and it's even include the sea area, the water, also part of indigenous people important resources. But in different countries, there are different way of either no recognition of customary land tenure, indigenous land right, or either given part of it in different law and policy. These are happening at the moment. For indigenous, we use our land as a whole so that we live we can live well with the culture and tradition we have. AIPP has been part of Land Right Now campaign for a long time, and it's continue as well. And for me, what important is that when there is a provision and preparation for land right recognition, it should be a bottom-up approach. For us indigenous people, we need to be proactive to engage in those processes. If we go hand in hand of those two things, then there is a better way of recognition of indigenous land right at the same time, reducing conflict and also protect and promote our natural resources in a better way for sustainable development. There are also some mechanisms like ICCA, Indigenous People Conserve Area, and so there are some those mechanisms recognize indigenous people conserve area at international level, and those are different ways that people are trying to get a collective land right. For me personally, I think individual land right is very dangerous because it can easily taken away, or like it's make indigenous people vulnerable to protect their land right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eamon, and also thank you so much all the panel members, and thank you so much all the audience who raised the questions. But we are running out of time. I actually like to continue because of the time constraint. I have to stop here. So I like to acknowledge the audience that we have collected all of your questions, and because of the time constraint, we could not answer now. But we'll try to put them up in our website, aippnet.org, as soon as we can. And of course, when we broadcast this video, we'll also summarize all the questions. So saying that, I'd like to also acknowledge without whom we cannot organize this event, without support, what we cannot do. It's AIPP members and networks in all 14 countries. Our regional indigenous AIPP, Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact Network, it is Indigenous Peoples Human Defender Network, Indigenous Voice in Asia Network, Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, Indigenous Peoples and Knowledge of Asia, Asia Indigenous Youth Network. And we also acknowledge our donors and partners, supporters of Indigenous, AIPP. Among them is the Global Environment Facility, Small Grants Program, UNDP, United Nations Development Program, European Union, International Land Coalition, International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, Majorior, Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, Swedish International Development Corporation, Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, Tamalpais Trust Fund, and Voices. So saying that, as we have already discussed, so I'd like to extend my sincere appreciate and gratitude to all the audience and all the panel members, and also Juan Carling and Michelle Tyler from the ILC for their message. But what I'd like to conclude is by saying somewhat is that, you know, that indigenous peoples movement and the struggle, and also we have this treaty, accord, agreement signed between the government and indigenous peoples and their representatives, because this is to defend our unique identity, our distinct culture, our traditional institutions and governance system through the self-governance and self-determination rights. So land is the central for the indigenous people's self-governance and to practice the self-determination rights, including the traditional political institutions. Our traditional political institutions, as you have already mentioned, how important it is that which have embodied with democratic principles and manifested in power sharing and co-responsibility among the indigenous community living in the territory. These principles are enriched by personal integrity, reliability, honesty, apart from their legal knowledge, wisdom, and sense of justice. The leadership of this body ensure security, peace, and stability in the community. So, by saying that, let's raise voice together to the rights of indigenous peoples, right to self-determination, our land rights, our territorial rights, and also stopping the militarization to indigenous peoples' land and territories, and also the implementations of the treaties and agreement conducted between the indigenous peoples and the government to defend indigenous peoples' culture, identity, and their self-determination. So with saying that, I'd like to thank you, AIPP Secretariat, particularly Guangchu and Guangchun, Program Coordinator and other members, and also communication team, Mona, and also Secretary General and other colleagues, as well as I'd like to acknowledge and thank you, Professor Kaka, for your time, Imin and Jason Pan, and Marifel, for your time and contribution to this discussion. Have a good time, good day, stay safe, well, and healthy. We hope we will see each other again. Bye for now. Thank you so much. Thank you all the audience for your questions as well again.